But what if this time the polls are actually underestimating Kamala Harris? With me now, sexy pirate and CNN senior data correspondent, Harry Enten.
Thank you.
All right, Harry, this is actually serious here. The polls have underestimated Donald Trump in 2016 and 2020. Any precedent for it happening 3 times in a row?
It's the great question, John. Is there any precedent that the polls will underestimate Donald Trump once again? Because that's all we hear about. Oh, Donald Trump's going to outperform his polls. So I went back and checked out whether or not a party outran the polls 3 presidential election cycles in a row in the key battleground states. It's never happened. It's never happened. 0 times since 1972. So if the polls are going to underestimate Donald Trump once again, that would be historically unprecedented. Now, maybe you want to make the argument that Donald Trump himself is historically unprecedented, but what normally happens is the pollsters catch on. Hey, we're underestimating. We're not taking into account some part of the electorate. They make adjustments, and I think that helps to explain why we have never seen that the same party has been underestimated 3 times in a row in presidential elections, at least over the last 52 years.
And Harry, you're seeing other evidence here that a polling miss, as we'll call it, wouldn't necessarily even benefit Trump as much this time.
Yeah. So, if we went back to 2020, right, all the polls, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, those 3 key Great Lake battleground states, they favored Trump by a wide margin. But there was this group of pollsters that actually had Trump out ahead. And indeed, Donald Trump's best polls in 2020 were 8 points better than the poll averages in those states. So there was this idea, this universe, hey, maybe the averages are really underestimating Donald Trump. This time around, the question that I had was, are there still these polls that may indicate that the averages are really underestimating Donald Trump? This time around, there's really not the evidence for it. The best polls for Trump actually only have him running about 3 points ahead of the polling average in the key Great Lake battleground states versus the 8 last time around. So last time around, there was this group of pollsters that said, hey, wait a minute, the polling average may be underestimating Donald Trump. This time around, John, they simply put do not exist. And one little last thing, I'll note that those polls that really underestimated Donald Trump were still too good for Donald Trump, the polls that indicated that the polling average was underestimating Donald Trump. So I wouldn't be surprised if even this is indicating, hey, wait a minute, these polls that suggest that Trump will do better than the average are actually too good for Trump.
Interesting way to look at it. And of course, we talk about 2016, 2020. We have had a big election since then.
That's exactly right. So, if the idea is that maybe the pollsters have, in fact, been making adjustments, you might have seen it in 2022. And what do we see in 2022 in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin? Well, it turns out that the average poll in those states actually underestimated Democrats by 4 points. It underestimated Democrats by 4 points. And I want to apply that to the electoral map, because if it turns out that the polls underestimate Donald Trump, or underestimated the Democrats, like they did in 2022, what happens? Well, Kamala Harris wins a sweep because she wins all these Great Lake battleground states. She wins down in the Southeast, and she wins down in the Southwest.
This is the narrative, guys. This is the most key thing. They talked about it. They've covered pretty much every base here, and I think this is an excellent segment so far, except maybe up until this point, but let's see if they have a caveat for that. But the key is the polls are already baking in all the potential Trump support that he could have, because the pollsters don't want to be massively wrong again. So the right-leaning pollsters are doing their thing, and then the rest of the group has caught up and is probably doing a little bit of the methodology that the right-leaning pollsters from last cycles were doing. So everything is baking in this swing, this secret Republican voter, this Trump surge. But what they're not exactly cooking for at this point is the 2022 and beyond reality that Democrats are actually seeing the similar shift that we've had in recent years. Now, this sort of wishful thinking map where you have the 2022 shift and Harris gets a 4-point shift in all of these swing states and then ends up winning in this massive landslide. This is also a little bit of fairy dust, in my opinion, because you're still going to get the Trump support, the massive wave of Trump support that he tends to bring about with him. Which also brings about the equal and opposite rejection and fervor on the opposite side to keep him away. But with the hidden or now very real situation of Roe versus Wade galvanizing and surging women to go and take back their rights, to take back the House, take back the presidency and the Senate, to go ahead and get the Supreme Court back on track, to rebalance things in this country. So if things do, if reality holds true, this is an election where you actually should see a Democratic surge, and you should see the woman candidate, the woman president, who's a symbol of that, going ahead and winning the election. Um, my feeling is that it's going to end up being a lot closer to like 270, 268, 276 something in the reality. But this is the narrative that needs to be discussed heading into the election and bearing out on election day.
Because she wins all these Great Lake battleground states. She wins down in the Southeast, and she wins down in the Southwest, and she gets the 319 electoral votes. The bottom line is this, dear audience and Mr. Berman. I think a lot of folks are sort of counting in that Donald Trump will, in fact, be underestimated by the polls. But when I'm looking at the evidence, I think you got to hold on a second. Maybe that'll happen. Maybe it'll happen. But I think that there are folks who are underestimating the idea that maybe Kamala Harris will be underestimated by the polls at least a week out.
A public service announcement from our senior data reporter, Harry Enten. Thank you.
Thank
very
you.
much. Sarah?
Thank you, Harry.
This morning, the two campaigns.
All right. Let's go ahead and leave it there. Very concise, excellent segment there from CNN, Harry Enten, and the like. Let me know what you guys think about the possibility of this Kamala Harris Democrat surge on election day. And please drop a like and a comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.